here today to have a tour of the exhibition Strange Weather. And it's a delight for me to introduce Dr. Rachel Nelson and Jennifer González, who've done a spectacular job, and they're going to give us a tour of this incredible exhibition at the University of California at Santa Cruz. And the exhibition is actually downtown at the Museum of Art and History, a wonderful collaboration between the two. Ladies?
Thank you, Jordan. It's such a pleasure to be able to show works from your amazing collection. You know, one of the things when Jennifer and I were thinking about this exhibition and how we were going to conceive of it, we were very much inspired by the moment that we're living. We were inspired by, this living through COVID, the amazing period of drought that we're in California, the kind of unrest that we're living through. So we were interested in thinking about the way that artists over the last 4 decades have worked to show us the circumstances of history, the relationships in which we're living, the kind of relationships with bodies and landscapes that have led us to this moment, that can tell us something about how we got here and also tell us about ways that we could go forward.
Yeah, I would say one of the things we really wanted to think about is how the body in nature operates. And we wanted to focus on 3 different genres of art practice. We wanted to focus on abstraction, portraiture, and landscape. And we found in all 3 of those a way of thinking through these questions that Rachel has already articulated. Questions of colonialism, questions of transformations of geology and geography, questions of representation and transformation. And so that influenced a lot of the way we selected works for the show.
Tell us first how you selected the amazing group that you have here. What did you go through?
It was a challenge to select the works. I mean, Jordan has 20,000 works in his collection, and it was COVID, so we weren't really traveling. So really, we had to go through and communicate with Jordan's wonderful people and begin to ask about certain artists and to bring out certain artworks, some of which we already knew, right? So we were looking for works that we knew and that we knew really spoke well to these issues, works by Edgar Heber Birds, works by Lorna Simpson. And then we also began to work with the staff to draw out other works that we thought would fit into the show. So it was an interesting experience and hopefully the only time I'll ever have the experience of curating an exhibition primarily through PDFs and images.
And we really have the staff to thank for helping us think through what kinds of pieces were available, and asked the staff if they could please give us works by a number of important American artists. And we got to see what was in the collection and get excited by what was there. So it was really the work that drove the show rather than an abstract idea trying to make the works fit. And so it was really exciting to kind of iterate between the works and the concept that we were working with. And it pushed us toward these 3 domains of abstraction and landscape and portraiture because we felt that they were all strong ways in which this question was being pursued. The question of why we are where we are right now today.
One of the works I think we gravitated to right away, or the series of works, is by Carlos Morales, who's an artist who lives in Mexico City, who has made these amazing works that are called useless wonder maps, in which he started with a map of the globe, really referring to the Mercator maps, which of course are the maps that we famously see of the entire globe flattened out into a 2D piece of paper. But of course, they're grossly misrepresenting the continents and the nations of the world. Things are too, parts of some continents are too big, some continents are too small, that they've been distorted in the act of flattening into a map. And of course, that flattening has been something that is also about the ways in which people and landscapes have been produced in the world in relationship to each other, that some continents have been imagined to be more important than others, right? And as we've shifted these sizes. So what Carlos Morales does is actually takes the countries and the nations and the continents and cuts them back apart and moves them around, really to show the constructions of the maps that we're already so familiar with, and the ways in which humans have already invented these surfaces sometimes to our detriment, right? And as he works through this series, and there's more of these works than what we're showing here, the pieces get kind of smaller and smaller and almost more abstracted, less recognizable of their sources, and this kind of infinite possibilities of what this map and this landscape could be.
And we really felt that this work invited us to think critically about what mapping is in general and different types of scales of mapping. And if we can now turn to Terry Winter's work, which is on this wall, Terry Winters is an important American painter and printmaker, and we really are delighted to be able to have these two works together. I'll talk first about Novalis, which is the work on the left, which is a beautiful print made with a kind of indigo colored dye and something that looks a little bit like the infrastructure of a leaf form, some kind of natural growth. Novalis is the name of a famous German poet and philosopher who believed that it was through nature that one could come to truth and true knowledge. And so you can see here Terry Winters is indicating through the title of the work that history of thought that really ties nature to culture, nature to thought, nature to human discourse and human understanding. And it almost looks as if there's a figure seated in the space as well, with something like a growth or a crown where the head should be. So it's a really beautiful rumination on that philosopher. Next to that is a really stunning work called Crimson Lake. And we can see with the color, the reference to crimson, the red. And we might imagine this to be a mix between a molecular read of natural elements. We can see in it leaf shapes, but also intricate networks connecting these sort of circle of blue and purple dots in the center. Could be detritus at the bottom of a lake. It could be a virus in a cell system of interior circulation. And so one of the great things about Terry Winters' work is just how much he allows our own interpretation to come into play when looking at the work, and invites us to think about how nature operates both at the molecular and at the grand scale.
One of the things that Jennifer and I both thought about this work is it's another kind of mapping, a kind of mapping of bodies at the molecular level, both human bodies and lake bodies, that we were really drawn to thinking about it. And then, of course, I think the kind of viral nature of the work as well. These two works by Joe Feddersen, Geese Flying and Black Ghost, are both works that Joe Feddersen speaks of as referring to Plateau Indian visual culture, thinking about the glyphs and the landscape and the different ways that Plateau Indians have represented the world. For us, I think when we looked at these images, we were interested in the fact that they are also landscapes. They have these kind of horizon lines within them. And if you look, for instance, at Geese Flying, you see that there's a kind of upper world and an underworld, or the lake and the ground, or some, these different things. But in this doubling, there's this interesting tension between this kind of overworld, underworld spot that particularly comes out in Black Ghost with the red line, the kind of dripping paint, in which it seems that the past and these kind of ghost figures are being carried into this overworld, this present. So we were really interested in this articulation, I think, of bodies, their surroundings, history, and current times. These beautiful works.
And the beautiful ghosting in the print itself, which allows for that history to kind of emerge almost from the fog or some other kind of surface tension like that in the print. It's really beautiful. When we wanted to keep the water and lake theme moving in this corner of the exhibition, My Blue Lake by Kiki Smith is a really interesting photograph that was produced by what's called a periphery camera at the British Museum. And it's a camera that is able to shoot a photograph in 360 degrees. And the work itself is then, after it's been printed as a photograph, the artist went back into it and hand-colored this beautiful blue tonality and took a etching tool and went through and carefully marked some of the facial features. And if you come close to the print, you can actually see these sort of whorls in the skin that are reminiscent of weather movements and kind of those gravitational weather formations that we sometimes see, but in a very sort of 19th century printmaking texture on the work itself. And because of the flattening, it links to some of the other pieces that we've been thinking about in terms of mapping, the way the globe is opened out and flattened, and the way the oceans are made to perform their kind of flattened selves in this global frame. So we really loved the way it was both a portrait and a landscape at the same time, and dealt with the question of sort of interiority. So My Blue Lake, about a state of being. And the artist herself said, it's about the fact that we always change, and change is always in the nature of our being.
So this beautiful work by Charles White, Love Letter 3, this beautiful print, has this woman who's standing kind of in this serene pose with her head tilted up to this conch shell, and this kind of lovely image of balance against this blue background. This, of course, is this kind of love letter to nature, a love letter to the kind of feel of the ocean that's encapsulated in the shell and that beautiful blue that's behind the woman. And I think that what's so strong and powerful to me about this work is that this idea of this equilibrium that's been achieved with nature in this work, of course, is set against a background of a history in which the ocean has many, many, many different resonances. The history of transatlantic slavery, the histories of violence and oppression, and the ways that the ocean has functioned within that. And yet there's just this like hope that equilibrium could still be achieved despite that past, or even as growing out of that past. That we don't have to deny that past in order to achieve back this kind of state, and kind of a spiritual state, a different spiritual state than we are currently in. Yes, Charles White has passed, but is a really important figure in art history, not only because of his own amazing prints and works. I mean, when he came up, but the amazing influence he's had on art in the United States. He was a teacher in LA for a really long time and has taught many of the artists now that we know as some of the most famous Black artists in the United States. So I think that what we've seen is a real revitalization of his career, where people are beginning to show his works in mass. There was a wonderful retrospective of his work at LACMA. Where else was it? And other places. Yes, it didn't open at LACMA. It opened someplace else. That was gorgeous. There was a wonderful recent retrospective of his work that was absolutely beautiful. And part of the reason why, of course, his legacy is being recovered is because of his students, his former students, that now are able to put back emphasis on him and the influence he's had on art.
But that's really the great thing about collectors and being able to find works that are lesser known, and how important it is to collect them so that the stories about art history can really be told as fully as possible. So we're really happy to be able to put it in the show. So we go from 1977 to 2009. This is the work of Nicola Lopez, who is a contemporary printmaker and installation artist. And we were really inspired by this work because we felt it got at some of the industrial underlying conditions of our present moment. And it has a kind of almost post-apocalyptic feel. There's a metal structure, but it seems to be in decay or falling apart. There are sort of broken pipes that lead to nowhere. Some of them seem to deposit a kind of dark blue sludge or pollution. So on the one hand, it sort of has a darkness to it, but there are these really beautiful, delicate flowers that are growing from this. And they are themselves almost architectural in their linearity, almost satellite-like in their crispness. So there's almost a sense of a kind of futuristic flower or a kind of futuristic science fiction quality to the new flora that might emerge out of the post-industrial wasteland. But the hopefulness that we found in this work was one of the things we wanted to bring in. And so that was one reason we wanted to put it also with some of the other works in the show.
I'd say too, Nicola Lopez is another person. I mean, I love these artists that have also spent their careers teaching and teaching other people how to do these crafts. So she's an important printmaker, teaches at Columbia, and is really innovative of how she treats the materials and the printing, and has moved her to these large-scale prints to also doing installations.
And one of the reasons we put these two together is we felt that they sort of had a lovely voice together, that formally the flowers move us to the Alison Saar, which Rachel will have something to say about.
So this amazing sculpture by Alison Saar is made out of bronze and features a character named Topsy from the famous Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, that talks of course, it is about our legacy of slavery in this country and the legacy of cotton and of plantations. Here, Topsy has been rendered in this heavy, heavy metal. The sculpture weighs like 1,000 pounds. And yet the lightness of the cotton that's kind of pulling her up out of this heaviness, as if she seems to be ascending, is a really powerful kind of contradiction of the work. You can feel both the weight of this history, and yet there's still things growing out of it. I mean, I think that this speaks really nicely, not only to Nicola Lopez's work, but also to Charles White's work, this sense that this is a history in which things grow, that things of beauty can grow, that great strength can grow from. It's interesting, the work is called Growed, and in the book, Topsy says something like, somebody asks her where she came from, and she's like, I growed.
Also, one of the regal aspects of the work is the way the hands hold the two items, like a scepter, like a queen. So there's a sort of throne-like aspect to the work. And on the one hand, there's the cotton, a sign of life, and on the other hand, the scythe, a sign of death. And here she sits kind of a balance between the two. And that's another powerful element of the work.
Showing two beautiful works by James Lavador, another Native American painter who's painted these beautiful grids of landscapes in which you can see the kind of sun dappling, lava flowing, light turning to look like almost like flames dancing on the landscape, mountains jutting out of the earth, done in this beautiful gestural painting on wood panels. The grid is interesting because, of course, it's an element that repeats a lot in modernist art history, in which, that draws you to kind of think about the different elements within it. And this is really about kind of the elements of the landscape as kind of as an act, right? As an event, as an action, right? The formation of a mountain, the form of lava spilling out on the landscape. That painting itself becomes another act of this, and another act of nature. And actually, that's one of the ways that Lavador speaks about this work, is that he realized that as a painter, he was creating another event, another act of nature, that he was like these other things. And so he's managed to capture this the beauty of a landscape that changes and that moves just as humans kind of change and move in our things, and the mutual relationship between these. When the landscape moves, we move. When we move, the landscape moves. And this gorgeous, gorgeous work that is such a pleasure to show.
And I'd love to add just a little bit about the way he painted. The striations in the rock are also created with this very specific kind of move and a painterly gesture. And there's a way in which the paint then mimics the way rock formations emerge from the earth. And that's one of these beautiful formal qualities that he's made his own sort of signature gesture, linking that gesture with the growth of rock itself. Beautiful work.
I think one of the things we're interested too is all these different ways that people are articulating relationships between bodies and the landscapes in which we move, that they're coming from different perspectives, that they're coming from different experiences and different relationships with the earth, and for us to try to see the different ways that artists have tried to bring in these different perspectives, the different experiences. We don't all have the same experience, even if we're in the same place. So how do we begin to articulate all those different points of views as well?
I think with Feddersen, we're getting something that's, with Lavador, we're getting something that's actually really quite personal. And I would actually read these works as being a conversation not only with the landscape, to which he's clearly intimately attached, but to the tradition of painting and landscape in general. We can see references to painters like the British painter Turner in, for example, the work on the right, where we have these very ghost-like, atmospheric representations of light that come through the clouds, through the smoke, through the fire. But it's much more dramatic in the sense here of a kind of destructive landscape, a lava flow, or potentially a prairie fire, so that there's a landscape at risk. And I think that that's one of the things that's really engaging about Lavador's work, is that question of landscape at risk.
And then I think I would just say too that that so much of this work is thinking about art, right? So Feddersen too is thinking about where the intersection between the Plateau Indian visual culture and modernism is. That was perfect. Yes. But thinking, Feddersen is very much thinking about the intersections between Plateau Indian visual culture and modernist art history in those works. I mean, it's another kind of grid that he's made in those works with his horizon line, thinking about the edges of modernism.
That's right, Rothko and other kinds of painters.
Totally.
Right. Leonardo Drew is an artist who's originally from Florida, but he's been living in Manhattan for 40 years, New York-based artist who has been well known for his sculptural projects for some time. And we're really delighted to have with us a work that's titled 215B. It's an explosive piece of art. You can see it has a large scale impact on the space. There's a sort of way in which it protrudes from the wall in a three-dimensional frame, and it invites the viewer almost to fall in to the depth of the work. It's really a piece about transformation and change. It's a piece about how things can become pulled apart in our contemporary moment. There's a subtle reference to the outcome of hurricanes and tornadoes. There is a way in which the elements that are put on the wall reference building materials, roof tiles. And yet what's amazing about this work is none of it is found objects. Every single piece in this large-scale installation has been carefully handcrafted to look as though it has been destroyed by the weather. And in fact, the artist says when he talks about the work that he is the weather, that he is the one who produces this kind of moment of transformation of materials and produces for us this very jagged engagement with that work.
One of the things that I was really struck with in this work is it feels like when you approach it, it feels like everything's falling apart. You know, you're in the middle of watching an explosion, only it's been frozen. It's stopped, so you can look at the explosion in its kind of composite parts, right? And to me, it feels also like this kind of generosity to stop it so that we can see the individual details of this like kind of disaster approaching. And particularly when we're thinking about it, the background of everything that's happening in society, this idea that we could slow down and look at the different parts. And actually, I think it speaks really well with the lavador, again, where we're thinking about how do we look at a landscape and see the different parts of it? How do we look at what's happening and see and break it down into pieces?
And look closely. And look closely, and I encourage others to look closely at the piece because there's so many wonderful details in it.
These beautiful works by Hung Liu are called official portraits, citizen and immigrant. Hung Liu, of course, was born in China and was trained in social realist styles. And when she's come now to the United States and we're reevaluating these forms to think about the experience of moving across borders, the ways in which bodies are rendered citizen or immigrant, and the kind of arbitrary nature of these designations. You can see in the work titled Citizen, both works have little passports at the bottom to make sure that, to drive the point home of this kind of movement of bodies across borders that changes their positionality in society. In Citizen, you see behind the figure who's standing proud, has her chin up proudly, there's the bamboo plant, which of course is indigenous to Asia. The one called immigrant, there's the corn, which is the plant that is associated with the Americas. She's thinking about the different ways that bodies get marked in these movements. What are the kind of different landscapes they're moving in, and how it creates different meaning. We were really struck by the fact that while citizen's face is upturned, kind of catching the light, immigrant's face is kind of shrouded, right? Cut down, catching the shadows. And all it's taken is this kind of movement across borders to differently create this figure.
This is the work of Edgar Heapofberts, an artist who for many years has been working with text as his primary form. He comes therefore sort of out of a conceptual movement, but as an indigenous Native American artist, he's thought quite a bit about the relationships between indigenous cultures and mainstream cultures. And we can see in this piece that he's trying to invite us, not your coyote, it's part of a piece called Not Your Coyote, that he's inviting us to think about a number of ideas. So the individual panels look a little bit like protest posters or signs on the street that someone might hold up. And at the same time, they are, in fact, beautifully rendered in these ocean colors, water colors, chromatic colors. and have dotted water stains on them. And so they have this watery feel to them. And he invites us to read these texts that in some regards are very straightforward, almost like a protest poster, such as "Do live life for your planet," which seem like a kind of imperative, but then also very strange texts, such as "Glory and stench, beauty and truth," that seem to actually have a broader historical scope, that seem to actually refer to a whole set of possibilities about the past and the future. Or, for example, references to nature, such as "Jungle no more, just polo party," which also might reference a history of colonialism and a transformation of natural landscapes to the landscapes of the rich and privileged. And all of these different texts can be read not only across, but down and even at the diagonal. And the way he stacks them invites us to think about this as a kind of descriptive landscape of life, of potentially contemporary life, that includes gummy bears as well as speed bumps, that also has "You shock me" and the horizon. And so all of these elements invite us, if we read them together, to take a new image of our contemporary moment.
This beautiful monumental work by Kehinde Wiley is from 2005, the World Stage Series, in which he's traveled to Brazil to paint this portraiture. Kehinde Wiley, of course, is famous for his portraiture. He's painted portraits of particularly young Black men and all over the world. And of course, most famously has painted the President Obama's portrait. But this work is really interesting because what he's done is in Rio de Janeiro, there's a statue in a square that is of a priest handing a cross to a young indigenous child, a young indigenous girl. And he's painted these two young men in the pose of this priest and the child. He's changed the image from one of paternalism and the evocation of kind of the colonial power relations that was embedded into the other one, and the kind of indictment of the church within those relationships, in order to transform it into a much more image of kind of like a fertile world, right? We're raining flowers here, the color palette. This is not an image of oppression. This is the opposite, in fact, of that sculpture. This is of a culture reclaimed. It's not happenstance that the colors in this work and the toucans, of course, are things that are normally associated with Brazil, a kind of tourist image of Brazil, even a colonial fantasy of Brazil, the kind of exotic, but which here has been reclaimed. That there's a way in which the kind of association with bodies and nature has been part of the power relationships that have been so problematic that were in that monument. But here, a new monument has been made that's taken all that in and suggests that there's another source of power to be found from it. So this is another monumental work. It's taken a statue and it's created another monument out of it, but a monument with a totally different purpose and a totally different aim.
I think part of his work is about understanding the beauty of each person and recognizing that each of us is a character that can become monumental, that these young men are just as important, just as beautiful, worthy of veneration and a kind of heroizing as any other person, and the kind of leveling gesture of painting a portrait in the style of portraits that were painted only of the aristocracy in the past is a way of changing the politics of that way of framing that body and that history.
So this is a wonderful work. It's a print of a painting by Carlos Almaraz, who was a wonderful painter from LA, who is really known, who died young, but is known for his amazing paintings of the cityscape, of capturing the life of LA, and particularly its freeway systems. He has a whole series of works that articulate car crashes on the LA freeway systems. This is an interesting print of one of those paintings that's actually outside of LA. It's one of the rare works in which he's painted the industrial farming landscapes that you find outside of Los Angeles, and that he's depicted a car crash then in front of neatly tilled fields on farmlands. I think was a very powerful, I mean, this car crash, this isn't exactly how car crashes look like, right? It's a very dramatic car crash. There's flaming like meteors kind of shooting out of this car crash into this neatly tilled landscape, really as a comment on exactly the kind of questions of how technologies are working within landscapes. What is the human inventions happening within this? Both in the car, which of course, the amount of people who die each year in car crashes is huge. Of course, the pollution that it wreaks into the landscape is huge. And yet there's also a subtle critique of the farming landscape too that's caught within that it's not just the car that's the problem here, but in this whole relationship that it's being enacted there's something gone awry.
So Lorna Simpson is well known for many different kinds of textual-based work. In this work, she actually decided to take images from a magazine, Ebony magazine, images that were in the magazine in the 1970s and 80s, and to repurpose those images through photo montage into these 3 different prints. So she cut out faces from the magazine and then added, in some cases, watercolor, or in other cases, other kinds of photo montage elements to create these windswept hairdos that look something like elaborate afros, and yet they also look like clouds and they look like the weather. And we felt that they spoke that way to our show very directly. They're also about consumption and about the history of identification and people working through, in Ebony magazine, what it means to be African American in the US. But also, for example, here we have a piece that's titled Reunite and Ice, which is about also the relationship between icebergs, which we know are melting today, and the kind of ice that she's wearing in this elaborate collar of diamonds and jewels. And thinking a little bit about the relationship between the history of consumption and the history of climate change embedded into this portrait of a kind of regal person.
I mean, one of the things that I'm really struck with these images is the diamond earrings. It's almost like the iceberg is melting off of her ears. But it's a psychological state more than a physical state that there's something about the weight of the climate that's sitting over this image.
So these 4 works by Wendy Red Star are a series. They are the 4 seasons: fall, winter, spring, and summer. And the artist invites us to think in these works both about nature and humans' relationships to nature, but also to the way that nature has been made artificial through the history of human representation. Each of the scenes is a staged photograph, and all of the elements in the photograph are artificial elements. So for example, in spring, we have an image cut out of a small doe. We have a wolf, a rabbit, and the artist sits in a delicate feminine pose, surrounded by artificial flowers and pictures. And in the back, what we begin to grasp is that the landscape that at first looks like a lake is of course nothing but itself a photograph that's been unfolded, sort of cheap wallpaper that has been plastered to the back of the image. And if we come closely, we see it's all artificial grass. This is true of each of the images the artist has painstakingly recreated, and with some sense of humor as well, this artificial landscape in which she places her own body as a kind of stereotype of a Native American woman. So she's raising a few issues for us. One is, what is the future of nature when it becomes artificial? She raises the question of how are indigenous peoples always read as natural objects, potentially themselves stereotyped by that position, and how has the history of photography been complicit in creating these representations of Native Americans? And there's a very beautiful, poignant quality to it. I look at these images and I think about the future in which nature may itself come under so much threat that all we have is the artificial and no longer the natural.
Julie Morettu's amazing abstract works many ways are one of the touch pieces. I mean, I think every piece in this exhibition, gives us what the exhibition is. But these works have, to me, even though they're abstract, are so very direct. These works Julie Moretu made in 2005 during a residency with Crown Point Press, really in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, the hurricane that devastated New Orleans and the Gulf Coast that same year. And of course, that hurricane, many people quickly receding into the past, but marked a very particular moment in history in the United States, because it was a massive, natural disaster, but the real disaster was how slowly the government responded to cities to New Orleans filling with water, to people losing their homes, people were drowning, and that many of the reasons why it seemed like the government wasn't responding quickly was because, of course, the population of New Orleans is historically Black, poor. The people that were in the city and were not able to evacuate. Many of them were elderly. And so thinking about the ways in which some populations had been rendered disposable, which I think still is something that we're still grappling with in our society, feeds into the background of these works. Of course, Julie Moretu isn't showing any of that in these works. These are completely abstract works. And yet, when you look at them, you can almost feel the power of the wind and the water as it rips through the Gulf Coast and rips through New Orleans that she's thinking about. The violence in which people are being abandoned to the storm. When I look at these works, I actually see weather charts. I see the footage and the weather charts and the maps of New Orleans that showed the water level rises after Katrina. That somehow she's taken those really graphic images of disaster and she's rendered them just into lines in this beautiful way. Jennifer mentioned earlier works being evocative of the painter Turner. These too, I think, are evocative of Turner's paintings of the sea, particularly his painting of the slave ship, in which there's the tumultuous sea that expressively painted into these forms as people are being thrown off of a boat to die in the storm. So I feel very much that these are also evoking that kind of history. And there's this beautiful sense of this kind of strangeness of this weather, this kind of power. But again, here, it's the hand that's made the gesture. It's the very body. And I have to say that one of the things that one of my favorite moments in this exhibition is being able to see Moretu's work with Drew's work. To see the moment stopped, these gestures frozen, so that we can take apart disaster. We can look at them in their minutest forms. We can look at them in their very materiality and think a little bit about the histories and the circumstances that have brought us to this moment. Thank you so much for joining this tour of Strange Weather. We wanted to take just a moment to talk a little bit about that title, which Jennifer came up with kind of early on, thinking about the circumstances of which we're around. Kind of, it's like, it's the strangeness of this weather that we are looking at when we look through these different works. And then it felt like every time we turned up another leaf in your collection, Jordan, we found some other thing that seemed to be referring to weather. We've got Leonardo Drew saying he acts as the weather. He is the weather as an artist. All these different things, the Moretu's work, there was this richness in which we were like, yes, these artists are thinking about weather.
And that weather is a historical weather as well, sort of what's happened in the past influencing the present. If we think of temporality as its own kind of weather and actions as its own kind of weather, then we can think about the way human relations are a relation of mixing and crossing and moving across borders, movement like weather patterns that transform when new bodies come to new places and transform the place that was there before. So that's part of why we thought about that as a theme.
And just to say one more thing too, the thing about weather, the reason why it's not strange climate is weather over long periods of time. So in some ways you would think that we were talking about climate, right? But actually with weather changes. Weather changes rapidly. Weather hasn't sunk in and grabbed the same way climate does. So to keep it thinking about it as weather also suggests that it is going to change, that it will change, that we will continue to change, and there's the possibility of that.
That's right, to evolve.
I think what's extraordinary about this exhibition is the selection of the work and how well it works curatorially in the space that you've worked with here. Remarkable. This is a show that could be in any museum anywhere in the world. And everyone in the world would be lucky if they heard both of you describe this work. You do an excellent job. And I've always said to people, you don't need to know anything about art, the artist or anything. Just look at the work and just don't stop thinking. We're so tuned to everything visual today that people get so frustrated if they see something and don't understand it. And I'll say, think about some music you heard. You don't sit there unless you're a musician. Well, how was it made or whatever? Or if you're a foodie, you don't sit there and say, well, how was it all put together or whatever. You're just enjoying it. I tell people, just enjoy the art. Just feel it. Let yourself go. Then, if you're lucky enough to go on a magical journey like this and have you guide us and teach us, it just takes that initial feeling and then absorbs our mind and heart and soul and adds so much more to the work. So thank you for having picked the work. The title I thought was a little strange initially, but I think in the end it works brilliantly with this collection of artists. And as I said, I wish all these artists were here right now so they could see their work and how it interacts in interfaces with the other artists. I think they'd all be honored and pleased that you selected the work and the way you exhibited it. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.